A very warm welcome to everybody. I think we will start now. I'm sure there'll be a few coming in at a later stage. So welcome to this parallel program session of the International Seminar on Food and Nutrition Security in Africa. And this session concerns specifically climate change, and the title we've given to it is "How can research contribute to tackling climate emergency in food and agriculture systems up to 2030? My name's John Morton. I'm Professor of Development Anthropology here at NRI, and I'm also the leader of NRI's program on climate change, agriculture, and natural resources. So I've just taken here some of what we saw a couple of years ago, actually, as potential key interventions of this program, identifying and assessing potential climate change impacts, especially on poor people's livelihoods, developing and implementing appropriate technical, institutional, and policy-based strategies for adaptation in collaboration with partners, examining and enhancing the interconnections between climate change adaptation and processes of agricultural innovation at national and local level, analyzing existing mitigation strategies and assisting in the development of equitable and sustainable future mitigation pathways, and supporting Southern voices in responses to climate change, particularly at the grassroots level. Now, those were areas of intervention. They weren't objectives as such. They are subject to change, and indeed they have changed since that point. A major source of that change is the fact that NRI and its partners have won and initiated their fancy food and nutrition security initiative. And this has had various effects upon us. It's allowed us to employ new capacity in a range of fields: climate change economics, agriclimate modeling, analysis of spatial and remotely sensed data, forest climate interactions and interventions, climate change and state fragility. It's also deepened our existing capacity on local institutions, on gender, on food systems and other topics in a climate change context. And it has it's allowed a renewed integration of social and natural science in climate change research within NRI. It's expanded our capacity with the named fancy partners. Andrew Westby on Monday explained that a certain set of African universities and other institutions are partners named on the fancy bids, but also it's enabled us to interact with Southern partners more broadly, and it's enabled us to recruit new PhD students on climate change topics, some of whom I hope are with us today. So this afternoon's session, we've thought of it as a forum for NRI staff and students and for fancy partners to contribute to developing NRI strategy for future research, with particular reference to sub-Saharan Africa. And we have 5 presentations on topics within climate change. So I'm not going to give you any great sell on why climate change is an important topic. I think we know that, but the people who make those presentations will set out why their particular research areas are priorities, what the most important research questions are within those topics, and how, in other words, with whom, by what approach can we do the research in a way which has impact. And then we'll have reflections from discussants, from panelists, and from yourselves as the broader audience. I'm not going to do a big introduction now of each of the presenters, discussants, and panelists. I could say a lot about each of them and their expertise and achievements, but I will introduce them briefly as they come to speak, and you can Google them to get a sense of their interests and their eminence. So a quick look at the program. We'll start with two presentations on climate change, land and natural resource use. One by Pamela Katic and one by Truly Santika, both of NRI. And then a presentation on climate change and food security by Professor Alex De Pinto, also of NRI. At that point, we have Leonard Olsen from Lund University, who will respond as a discussant to those three presentations, leading us into a discussion, a short discussion at that point, followed by two more presentations, one on climate change, food systems, gender and social inequality by Professor Anna Jernek of Lund, and one on climate change, climate variability and conflict by two of our NRI colleagues, Tilman Brück and Uche Okpara, followed again by responses to those presentations by June Po and by Dr. Eria Olowo Nyango of Makerere University, after which we go more into a general discussion mode, and I will, at that point, I will allow Richard Lambol and Valerie Nelson, who are going to be facilitating, to explain more about what's happening. So I will, at this point, go straight to our first presentation to Dr. Pamela Katic. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you very much, John. Let me share my screen. Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why I think climate and water is a research priority, a few research questions worth exploring, and also what is required for our research to deliver sustainable impact. Many of the points in this presentation were derived from a position paper I wrote together last year with Dr. Lashmi Pant, also at NRI. So I also want to acknowledge Lashmi. Thank you very much. I think you're also in this call. Okay, so let's start off. The scientific evidence is clear. The climate is changing and will continue to change, affecting societies mainly through water. What you can see here is the latest edition of the United Nations World Water Development Report entitled Water and Climate Change. This report aims at helping the water community to tackle the challenges of climate change. And also it informs the climate change community about the opportunities that improved water management offers in terms of adaptation and mitigation. I decided also to include this figure, which shows us that floods and storms account for nearly 90% of the most severe natural disasters. Global floods and extreme rainfall events have surged by more than 50% this decade. This indicates that when we combine climate change adaptation and mitigation through water, we have a win-win proposal. We improve the provision of water supply and sanitation services, and we also have an opportunity to combat both the causes and the impacts of climate change. Such proposal is of particular importance nowadays for COVID-19, because allocation of water resources must prioritize those at greatest risk. You can see here that a large proportion of the healthcare facilities in the world don't have access to hand washing sanitation, and sanitation facilities. Water is also a priority research area because it can act as a climate connector and spur collaboration across sectors in response to climate change. Here is an example of a network map indicating communications among water, food, and energy organizations in San Antonio region in Texas in the United States. What you can see here by the blue squares, these are the water organizations. The red squares represent energy organizations, the green food, and the orange cross-cutting organizations. It is fairly clear to see that the majority of the ties in the figure are to water organizations. We see this cluster around the middle of the figure, middle left, around all the water organizations. In terms of the most important research questions, well, there's quite a lot that I can think of, but I decided to concentrate on a few. In terms of water and politics for climate impact, I think it is necessary to create a new way of thinking to better manage complex social, economic, and political interaction needed to ensure that we can meet the water needs of all. We can see here in the figure that I have included on the right, that water is the most frequently mentioned sector in African countries and disease, in terms of both the vulnerability of the sector, but also the need for urgent investment. And water is followed by agriculture and health. Other types of other research questions that I think are important relate to the relationship between food and nutrition security. These are negatively affected by climate change and increasing water variability. The figure here shows entry points to increase the nutritional impact of water management investments. However, I think that further research is required on integrated solution in water for nutrition, food, and health to build resilience for the well-being of vulnerable populations. Other important research questions involve how to strengthen intersectoral cooperation to respond to shared risks, and also how to improve public spending and how to develop new and innovative mechanisms to attract financial flows. A nice illustration of these two research areas is given by the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund. I don't know how many of you have heard of this fund, but basically this is a public-private partnership which involves the Kenyan government, private downstream companies, and the Nature Conservancy, which invest upstream to help poor communities adopt farming and forestry practices that improve yields, but also reduce water use and soil erosion, thus delivering benefits downstream. The next set of research questions that I want to mention relate to how we can design and implement more inclusive governance practices, including generation of climate and water information, participatory knowledge creation, and sharing. I also included here an example to illustrate this type of research questions, which is given by MINISAS in South Africa. This is a novel tool for community participation in river health monitoring and management. And I found it quite fascinating, and it's widely used by schools in South Africa. Finally, companies also need to address water-related risk of climate change. And there is a need for research to design actions to better integrate corporate efforts on climate change and water. Here, there's also a few examples of actions that have enhanced corporate water resilience. This includes sustainable sugarcane farms in Africa. I put here the example of Ilovo and Sus farms, and also recently developed financial tools by the World Bank to enable water providers to better respond to the pandemic. Finally, I just want to refer to how I think we can do research in a way that has impact. I think first and foremost, we need to rethink what is understood by impact and how impact is created. Initially, impact was understood through a simplistic linear model of knowledge transfer. This is still where much of the research lies today. These models evolved to place greater emphasis on dialogue, engagement, or collaboration, while retaining the linear relationship between research and impact. This is what we can call a relationship model of research impact. We recently began to recognize research impact as part of a more cyclical process of knowledge production and policy making. And finally, impact can also be recognized as part of more complex systems of knowledge mobilization. And in this model, this is the only model where academic research processes engage with ongoing knowledge activities of development practitioners, and also recognizes the effect of the broader national and international knowledge systems in which this cycle is embedded. So I think that we should try and migrate our research efforts to this last model of knowledge creation and research impact. The last slide refers us back to a tale of a frog and the boiling water I often use when I talk about water. And the tale goes that there's a frog already in the water, and it says that if the frog jumps straight into boiling water, then it will jump straight away out of the water. But if it jumps when the water is warm and the water keeps on getting hot, perhaps it would just stay there and boil to death. So what I'm trying to ask us today is whether we are hot enough to act now, or are we still waiting for the water to get hotter? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pamela. That was extremely thought-provoking. I'm going to proceed pretty much straight away to Truly Santika, who's going to talk about forests and landscapes. Just before I do that, a reminder, all presenters try and keep to time. That was actually very precise, Pamela, because we got to make up a bit of time that we lost at the beginning. People to keep their microphones muted, and people who have sort of immediate questions for the presenters, please put those in the chat, because that'd be the way that I'll run the presentation, at least for run the discussion for the presentation phase. So over to you, Truly.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Pamela, for the really inspiring presentation. So I will now presenting the other half of the climate change, land and natural resource use session, with particular focus on sustainable landscape, forest and climate issue. I'm presenting on behalf of our team, Professor Valerie Nelson, Professor Jeremy Hager, and Dr. Kaysera Katin. So why is forest issue a challenge? Forests cover about 30% of the global land area. The largest share occur in tropical region. And here the amount of tree biomass and carbon per hectare is higher, suggesting higher biodiversity compared to other regions. So forest is essential for climate regulation and maintaining healthy ecosystems important for human lives, such as preventing soil erosion, landslides, floods, and drying of soils. It also provides livelihoods and indigenous sovereignty. Many communities and households, especially in developing countries, depend on non-timber forest products through hunting, fishing, and forest product gathering, which is an important part of their livelihood strategies. Forests also provide habitat for a majority of world biodiversity and wildlife. So about 100 million hectare forests have been lost through conversion since 1990. So the rate of deforestation has decreased, but the remaining forests now are threatened by fires, drought, and adverse weather events. So deforestation has also increased the vulnerability of ecosystem and human to pests and multiple diseases. It has profound impacts on indigenous peoples and rural communities who depend highly on the forest ecosystem and jeopardizing their food security. So on the bottom left figure, we show that the net deforestation that occurs as a result of trade, particularly from the food and forestry sectors, based on 2013 data. So the net deforestation is estimated as the deforestation driven by imported goods minus exported goods. So it shows how unsustainable food systems are driving deforestation, especially in the tropics. It's driven mainly by commodities such as beef in the Amazon and Australia, soybean in the Amazons, oil palm in Southeast Asia, and timber. So large-scale deforestation by agribusinesses is widespread, and these are often supported by national government to boost national economy. Smallholders are also contributing to deforestation, but at a smaller extent. So increasing global demand for food, fiber, and fuel are putting pressure on land and natural resources. And globalization process are also shifting the power of over local resource from local communities and states to global multinational companies. So the relationship between landscape, forests, and climate is complex. But the system can be approached from the socio-ecological lens, in which the flow of the system is regulated by a combination of ecological and social system and processes that is defined at spatial, temporal, and organization scales, and it is highly dynamic. I won't go into the details of this socio-economic system and process, but an important note is that with the globalization, the system occurring in one landscape is now connected to other systems elsewhere in other countries. For instance, decline ecological system from deforestation in one area can be driven by social system in other areas or countries, for example, through consumption behavior or market demand. So within the NRI, we have a very diverse communities that have explored or tried to disentangle some parts of the socio-ecological components mentioned earlier. Some of us have looked at the environmental governance and landowner rights in sustainable landscape, fair, ethical, and regenerative business models, livelihoods for smallholders and indigenous communities, as well as the social and gender dimensions of natural resources management. Some of us have evaluated the effectiveness of sustainable supply chain and landscape initiative in agriculture and forestry, the trade-offs between economic productivity and ecological sustainability in agricultural landscape, as well as evaluating the social and environmental impacts of land use change. So we have also evaluated the performance of sustainable forest management and climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. So with regards to the most important research questions within the landscape, forest, and climate issue, we suggest 5 potential key topics to explore. This includes, first, what is the nature of spatial and temporal trade-offs and synergies between forest conservation, restoration, and improvements in livelihoods? Second, how effective are sustainable landscape initiatives? What combination of measures are required at different scales to catalyze transformative change? How do we tackle displacement effects or leakage? Third, how are public, private, and civic actor power relations changing in transitioning landscapes, and what are the implications for sustainability outcomes? And fourth, how are sustainable landscape transitions affecting issues of equity and human rights? So for how and with whom to do research with impact, we propose 7 leverage points, including first, strong partnership to encourage demand-driven co-design of research and mobilizing evidence and commitment for action. Second, interdisciplinary, cooperating both biophysical and social processes. So there is a need to define landscapes or territories as socio-ecological systems involving governance as well as biophysical features and human connection to place. Third, multi-scale lens. Here we emphasize on recognizing interconnected, nested nature of socio-ecological systems and the importance of understanding how change at one scale plays out at other scales. Fourth, a systematic approach by means of exploring relationships within the system, but also focus on root causes which may be extraterritorial. And fifth, the complexity of socio-ecological system means that stakeholders have incomplete knowledge and uncertainties. Therefore, transdisciplinary approach are necessary, not only interdisciplinary working, but also engaging the public in landscape research, monitoring, and decision-making. And six, developing models of socio-ecological system to understand and inform landscape management decision based on likely livelihood, climate adaptation and mitigation, and broader environmental and social outcomes. And lastly, the sustainable landscape field is already vibrant and global community in practice. Therefore, there are opportunities to build partnership for teaching as well as consultancy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Truly. Again, another really interesting presentation that should give people some cause for thought. Do please put questions in the chat, but I will hand over directly to Alex DePinto to talk about climate change and food security.
Thank you, John. Let me try to share my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, okay. We can.
Full delay. Okay, it looks like I don't really need to convince many people here about the urgency of working on climate change. But besides the magnitude of the changes in temperature and precipitation, I always like to remind myself and others about the speed at which changes are expected to happen. Here in this slide, you can actually appreciate how agriculture developed in a very stable environment, very stable temperatures for about 12,000 years. And then in the next 200, 300 years, things are expected to change quite rapidly. And these changes in temperatures and precipitation will have a negative effect on agricultural production. I can't show all the different effects on all different crops, but here is a projection for corn, for instance, where you see yellow and reds. Those are the losses. You can see how spread they are around the globe. And these are the expected changes in yields in Africa. If you look at the bold vertical line, that indicates zero change from current yields. Moving to the left, you find losses, and to the right are gains. You don't see much. You don't see many things on the right side, meaning that we mostly expect to be losses across all sorts of categories of crops. And these changes will have an effect on the number of people at risk of hunger, and also on the people who are undernourished. Here, I created this slide showing the number of people at risk of hunger due to climate change in 2050, and the difference between the global south and the global north. To me, it's frightening. It shows that a lot of things can happen. A lot of massive migration is possible. In the meantime, because of economic growth, changes in income, people getting richer, the demand for staple foods, and even more so for non-staple food, like meat, eggs, fruits and vegetables, is expected to grow faster than population, creating even higher pressure on our resource base. And we are learning how important diets are. It's incredible. It's really incredible to think that not long ago, we were only talking about calories and talking about pumping out calories from our fields. But studies more and more, including this one that I'm displaying here, it's from Marco Springman at Oxford. It shows that higher mortality rates will be due to a reduction in the availability of certain healthy foods, like fruits and vegetables, because of climate change. Way more deaths than those that are caused by being underweight. And we also are learning that what the Eat, Answer diet proposed as a sustainable diet might actually be unaffordable, particularly in developing countries, specifically in developing countries. And they might be out of reach of the poor without work on productivity. The thing is that the sustainable diet proposed by the Lancet might actually be unaffordable without a lot of traditional work on farm productivity, on increasing incomes, and raising people out of poverty. And last point I wanted to make about the framing the issue is that I was actually looking at the today estimates for the effects of COVID-19 on emissions, and emissions have been were reduced significantly in 2020. That's about, the 2.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents is about double, a little more than double what we think it's necessary to stay below 2 degrees, the 2 degree threshold to be safe. At the same time, IMF estimates that the global economy shrunk by 4.4%. All this to say that if we want to reduce emissions without causing this much pain, the pain that we're experiencing right now, we have to do a lot of work in our research and a lot of work with policymakers and also private industries, as I will say later. So there I'm going to go very quickly through my research, what I consider research priorities. There's a lot of long-standing research issues that are still not resolved, like improve our understanding of the adoption of climate-smart practices, of barriers, and possible synergies. We know, studies show that if farmers adopt the right practices, the famous, we might have heard triple wins of climate-smart agriculture are actually possible, not in a single location, but globally. Well, these practices are not adopted because of barriers that we still have to learn how to overcome. And also, we still need to do a lot of work on the role of risk and risk-averse behavior, even though particularly economists have worked a lot on risk, but it's really surprising how little work on decision-making on the risk is present in the climate change literature. Because the precedence has been given to the effect of changes in mean and temperatures and precipitations and trend. But actually, research has shown how the effects of risk-based decisions by farmers can compound with the negative effect of climate change. So it's not a magnitude. The effects are not should not be disregarded, and we have to do more studies and analysis on that. Also, studies have shown how risk studies have concentrated only on the yield variability and market variability, but there are all sorts of other forms of risks that farmers are facing that are not currently studied. There is a lot of must-do research to move forward. There's work on promoting cooperative behavior for the management of degraded landscapes. There are new approaches like forest landscape restoration which involves agriculture, and it seems to be capable of delivering services across many important dimensions, including those that are important for climate change, like reducing emissions and increasing carbon stock, while preserving or increasing agricultural production. And again, risk management in connection with gender and nutrition, the trade-off and synergies. I've recently published a study, actually, that was first for me working on these gender issues, in which we saw how women empowerment helps with increasing crop diversification in the field and with nutrition outcomes, which are all forms of sort of risk management and also adaptation to climate change. We also need to implement more the system thinking that we often talk about, and use a climate resilient food system approach, meaning that we have to think about storage, marketing and retail system. They all need to adapt. Investment in cold storage options, cold storage options that will need to increase. They will need to increase because many areas will become hotter. And understanding the investments on transportation infrastructure that will need to adapt to a more variable climate and high incidence of extreme events, and also the role of rural-urban interface and urban agriculture. To increase the impact of our research, well, in my opinion, we need to do a lot of work and involve even more the private industry, which is always a difficult issue, particularly for the academic world. And we need to talk more and learn how to talk with policymakers. In my opinion, part of this involves creating these tools that allow you to explore alternative scenarios and answer these what-if questions. And these tools must be open, transparent and flexible. Tools that allow multi-objective analysis and contingency planning. And also, and this really is looking at ourselves, universities, we must favor multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary work and collaborations across researchers from different disciplines, and probably have to put a different system of incentives for researchers. All of this is also in sort of with the idea of favoring the collaboration across ministries to implement this system thinking that we often talk about. And we need to do all this work because one thing that I understand more and more as I work on this issue is that in order to address these climate change issues, people from international organizations, state level, cooperatives, farmers, they all be somehow connected to actually have an effect on emissions and adaptation at a large scale. And this is what I call the stakeholder dimension. And we have to do a lot of research to be able to connect all these different actors to achieve results at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. A lot of food for thought there, and some great visuals. Some people have commented in the chat on the usefulness of those maps. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Leonard Olsen, who is the discussant for all three of these presentations we've seen, to talk maybe for about 5 minutes. Leonard, thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for this incredible challenge to discuss 3 very rich presentations in 5 minutes. So I will do that by raising 1 or 2 perhaps provocative questions to each one, rather than comment on the presentation, because they were very rich and it will take too long to go into them. So if I start with the water presentation, I take them in that order. So my question is, I mean, water is, of course, an incredible problem, but what is the best approach? Is it to focus on the water or on the activities in which water is handled or managed or polluted? So is that a problem, that we put too much focus on water and therefore will not really be able to revise or change, for example, agriculture? Agriculture in most continents except Europe, I think, is the main water use. So maybe it's through these other activities that we can best solve the water problems. My second question is, when it comes to water, and particularly the wash, there is an enormous need to improve the water and sanitation hygiene for poor people. I mean, it's one of the absolutely most fundamental problems we have. But has there been too much of a focus on the poor? Perhaps we should look at the rich also, because a real problem is that if everybody is aspiring to the kind of solutions that the rich have, that is truly unsustainable, because the systems cannot really function. The way we waste water among rich people is absolutely unsustainable. So that's my question. If we can the focus of the research be shifted and therefore be more effective water? So that was water. When it comes to forest and landscape, I think a real challenge here is, of course, that all the problems, or most problems here, they are really, really teleconnected. With that, I mean that the drivers and the problems are spread geographically around the globe. So how can we be effective? And I have can social scientists learn from the natural scientists? The natural scientists have been very, very good at compiling these large pictures from many small studies, while social scientists have been very bad, I think, about this. Of course, it is easier when natural scientists, they use the same methods, they measure things in meters and kilograms or tons and so forth. The social scientists, they use other ways of studying or measuring. But I think there would be this teleconnected nature of the problem, I think would benefit enormously if social scientists could learn to some extent and create these larger pictures, because we reiterate these wonderful remote sensing maps of deforestation on different continents, but how do we actually go from there to actually do something about the teleconnected problem? So how to deal with the teleconnection in forest and landscape. When it comes to food, I see that my clock is running here. About food, I see there are two sides of food problem, to simplify. I mean, there's a producer side and there is a consumer side. On the producer side, can we have food security without food sovereignty? Food security is the topic that sort of the more sort of mainstream topic where we focus on how much is produced and how it's distributed and how can people access it and what is the quality of it. But food sovereignty raises the important question about who has the power to decide where are the decision making, where are the decisions taken. So that's connected much more to the conditions under which food is produced. And I argue that there can be no food security without food sovereignty. And linked to this, I think, is to bring up the concept of food regimes that was coined originally by Harriet Friedman, sociologist Harriet Friedman in the 1980s, where she talked about food regimes. And currently we have a food regime which is very sort of globalized, and it's dominated by a kind of biotechnology. Science or biotechnology can promote the global food regime. But my question is, can we have more than one food regime at a time? Can they coexist? Because I think that food sovereignty is actually arguing for having alternative food regimes. But then the question is, can they coexist? Or are we bound to just have one dominant? And there is, of course, the crucial question about bringing in the industry, but perhaps not asking the industry, but actually finding ways of reducing the incredible influence that the combined agrochemical and seed industry has on agriculture. I find that rather disturbing. And on the consumer side, I think we have one incredible problem there, and that is that the important principle from environmental economics, the polluter pays principle, is actually inverted. We know the polluter pays principle works, at least in some cases, but in food it's inverted because we as consumers, we are supposed to pay more for the food that has been produced in a sort of in an environmentally problematic way. That is, of course, I don't think we can expect the consumer side to improve as long as we have this absurd situation of the polluter pays principle inverted. So with this, I have consumed, I think, 6 minutes of the 5 I had. So I'm sorry about that. And I hand over to John.
Back to the chair, I hope. Thank you very much, Leonard, for some very, very provocative questions. sent back to the presenters. I will, in terms of water, I'm afraid that Pamela Katic has had to step out of the meeting. I wonder if Lakshmi Pant, who was her co-author on the internal study she mentioned, would like to say anything about your points, whether the best approach to dealing with the problems of water is directly through water or indirectly through other sectors like agriculture, and this question about whether in WASH development there's been too much focus on the poor and not enough on sustainable technologies for the rich. Lakshmi, I don't know if you're able to say anything about that.
Yes, we're doing some exchanges on the chat forum. Out of my personal interest, I was looking at the WEFT Nexus, Water, Energy and Food Security Nexus. And being brought up on a smallholder farm, energy, I feel like, is a necessary evil. Many smallholder farmers, they depend on biomass energy, so it's indoor air pollution. And then now when I look at the emerging changes, people are more and more dependent on LPG gases, even in remote rural areas. So I feel like we need to take the WEFT Nexus approach, linking water, energy, and food. Those are the three sectors, water is being demanded. And I agree with the comment on WAS. WAS has become another issue linked to public health, and, we are like more of into, ecosystem degradation and water quality issues. And that is coming from all the sectors, agriculture, industries, and even urban development. So these are my quick reflections on, what we are talking. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I rather put you on the spot there in Pamela's absence, but we can continue those discussions in the facilitated session later. Truly, Leonard asked one question on teleconnections and whether social scientists can learn from natural scientists. And I know that you're someone who really spans the two fields anyway, so I hope you'd be in a good position to say something about that.
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. I mean, that's really really an interesting sort of issue. Yeah, I really like the idea of, I think there's really a lot that we can learn from both sides, because I myself, I come from a mathematician background, quantitative background, but and then start to move into a more practical sort of application, looking into the land use change, and then I started to work with social scientists as well, and it gives me some really broader picture, and then also going into details of how things are working, and it's quite fascinating actually. So in looking at this teleconnection, I feel that natural sciences can have some sort of broad understanding of the landscape within the regional or mesoscale, regional and broad scale analysis. But then in order to get into the detail of the interaction between people, the governance and the social complexities underneath, we need to get some input from the social scientists. So I do really like the idea of having those kind of this kind of collaboration increased. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Alex, if you would like to say anything on Leonard's questions, can we have food security without food sovereignty? And should we be looking for a single or a plural food regime? Also his question on how can we sort out the arrangements by which we pay more for sustainable food.
Yeah, about this new food regime, new food regimes question. It's really difficult for me to answer. Maybe if I can offer some hope, is that maybe the current boundaries, planetary, local, that we experience and we're starting to understand, they're sort of dictated by the environment of which we are becoming more and more aware, are giving us an opportunity to rethink these food regimes. I'm afraid that it will be very difficult to change the capitalist nature of the current regimes. That might take a long time, and we'll see. I'm not even sure. I haven't thought through these things that much because they're outside. We're going in an area that that's a little outside my expertise. A little closer home is this thing about the inverted nature of the current structure of the food prices, which I really like as a comment, and you're preaching to the choir because as an environmental economist, we're very much in favor of internalizing all the externalities that should show up in the cost of food, and which in a way that should make the food items that are more harmful to the environment also more expensive. I think, but you see, I mean, yes, I think there's plenty of literature. It's on that, and it's environmental economics 101. And still, it's a very difficult battle because the status quo, it's strong and it's difficult to change. And again, the current crisis might give us an opportunity to rethink these things and to start internalizing these externalities.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, for those thoughts, both on what you could answer and what you couldn't answer, both very much appreciated. There's been a lot of discussion in the chat. I'm actually going to hold that over. I think we can revisit some of the comments we've heard and many of the comments that are in the chat during the facilitated discussion. We're very much taking a note of those points. So I'm going to hand over for the third presentation on climate change and gender to Professor Anne Jernek, also of Lund University. Anne, if you could go ahead, please.
Okay, so my name is Anne Jernek. I'm based at Nexus, Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies in Lund. And I know John through interaction with the PhD school that we had. So John came over to be our discussant a couple of times for our PhD defenses. And then you also stayed here for some time. Anyway, so the theme is now global change, climate change, global food system, gender and social inequality, and we have the three questions that I'm going to address. So first of all, the questions as we know them, we've heard already. Why is this a priority research area? What are the most important research questions? And how, with whom, by what approach can we do the research in a way which has impact? So first of all, as a starting point, I would say that I will then see these three together as integrated in a sense in real life. So there are multiple stresses within climate change and within gender and other social inequalities, and also in the global food system. So these multiple stresses might interact and converge, which means that they can be reinforced. So the situation can be even worse if you are subject to multiple stresses, but it might also open up the potential for addressing things and finding synergy. So if you address one and solve one aspect or one problem, you might also be able to solve other issues. So let's see them integrated. So And as mentioned, we are focusing on sub-Saharan small-scale farming, and I'll do that also as an example. So the priority area, why is this a priority area? So within climate change, we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a drought, floods, rising temperatures, erratic patterns, etc. And all this makes it difficult for small-scale farmers to plan the work, to produce food and to subsist. So if they were used to having rains in October or November, and all of a sudden they have the rains later in the year, how can they even plan? So it makes it even more difficult for small-scale farmers. You can also say that climate change impacts and responses, both of them, are inherently unequal and power-laden. So that's also a reason for why we should look into this issue. When it comes to food, Leonard mentioned food, or you talked about food insecurity, and Leonard mentioned also food sovereignty, which I will not address here. But just to take some of the more recent figures from FAO, what I understand is that the number of hungry people is increasing in the world. So in 2020, we had 820 million people, and it's up from 2016, and it has went up quite a lot. And also, not only that, the figures are increasing, but they're also expanding the fastest in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. When it comes to gender, I would say that inequality and intersectionality, as we know it, I mean, we have intersecting categories of age, gender, race, locality, sexuality, and so on. All this matter for climate change impacts and responses. So if we think the climate change in the first place with impacts and responses is unequal, then of course we have to look into and we have to unpack and deconstruct what that inequality consists of. So it also means that when we do research, we should then apply some kind of gender sensitivity in studying climate change. And I think that's necessary to really understand inequalities. And then also I call for more research in this field. Right, so if we take gender and social inequalities, so what is it that we see? What are the dynamics that we see here? And gender, as you know, is relational. It's not about women or men, it's relational. So it also means femininity, masculinity. It also involves how the world and the livelihoods are organized. So in every country or in every setting, in every region or any setting where we have people, you can try to identify and locate a gender regime. And with that, also gender norms, which includes values, norms, rules and regulations, and so on. And all that will influence or even determine several aspects that are important for small-scale farming, such as the productive, the reproductive, and discursive rights and responsibilities, for example. So you can ask the question, do women have right to land? They may not, but they still have the responsibilities to produce for and feed their children. When it comes to livelihood activities and farming practices and work tasks, they are often organized and divided according to gender. And these tasks seem to be very, very gendered and firmly gender coded, but there can of course also be some changes in that. And we can also look at the access to, dependency on, and control of, and use of various resources, such as environmental resources, and other resources could be land, for example, but it could also be the decision-making power within the household. And then, of course, you can also look at the impacts from and responses to climate change. How are they understood from a gender perspective, from various gender theories and schools of thought? When it comes to gender and climate change, you can also ask these questions, and this has been done already in research that we have seen. So here I explicitly say women and men, and not only gender, but women and men may differ in their experiences of climate change impacts and climate variability. So if, for example, you are more in charge or more responsible for certain practices or activities or work tasks, and these are hit harder than others, then you might experience this in a certain way, and you may feel more impacted by it. Also, the perceptions of associated risk and priorities and how you tackle that. So you might think that you would like to prioritize the work tasks or the practices that you are in charge of, and not the other parts of household. The actual need for social innovation and skills in technology uptake might also vary along gender lines, and women and men being in charge of different activities and practices may also feel this. And also when it comes to education, for example, we often see that men get more access to education also for technology uptake or various practices which has to do with sowing and harvesting and all other activities in food production. It also has to do with rights to and decision-making power over environmental resources. So as I said, land, many women often get land through certain rights via their husbands, so they don't really own the land themselves, but they get access to it via some other person, and that's also a bit fragile when it comes to, you know, the long-term access to resources. And then the strategies for adaptation and mitigation in response to climate change may also vary along the lines of women and men. I don't say they always do, but they may do that, and we have seen that sometimes. But the positive thing here is also in times of crisis, in times of adaptation, you may also see that during such rapid social change, there might also be shifts in this coding of what women and men can and are supposed to and should do as a practice or activity in agriculture. So when it comes then to the questions we should ask, I would say we could start here. Impacts and responses, how they distribute between regions, sectors, and groups of people. So we know quite a lot about this, but we still have, I mean, while climate change or with climate change and increasing impact from climate change, we also see new cases, we see new regions, countries, areas drawn into this. So this matter of distribution is eternal. I think we shouldn't give up on this, but we have to do more research on it. And here we have several frameworks like environmental justice frameworks of various kinds and so on. So we know from development where we have studied this for a long time, but now with environment, we also have new frameworks or modified frameworks for studying this. And what is the effect of climate change on existing inequalities? Will they be alleviated or reinforced? So we can study inequality and the new inequalities, but what about the existing ones? Will climate change really reinforce the inequalities we have, or will it open opportunities for actually alleviate some of the inequalities we had? So that's, of course, a very important question. Others also talked about trade-offs and synergies. So I think it should be mentioned here, where the synergies and conflicts between adaptation and mitigation and development. So I come from the development side here, so I also bring that in. So, I mean, instead of maybe seeing them as competitive, either you do adaptation or mitigation, and sometimes that's the case, but you could also strive to bring them together and also see if you can come up with some developmental effects at the same time. So it's I think also that's very important still to look for those conflicts and synergies, tensions and potentials. And also who is represented in and has a voice in adaptation policies, for example. It's often said that adaptation is needed and the government should supply more funding for it, and there is the Global Fund and so on, but who is actually involved in a particular region, a particular community, in a particular group of people. So if you're close to the problem, one would expect that you also have a say here. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And that is, again, an inequality matter often, a justice matter, and it could also very well be a gender issue. And also, how will climate change affect food production in small-scale farming? So in some regions, you say maybe there are better opportunities, but in most areas, I think it becomes more difficult. There will be more drought, there will be more violent weather patterns, and I think the flooding or the drought or the flood coming quickly after the drought and so on will also interfere. And also, as I mentioned from the beginning, the planning for farmers. So if we move on to food and gender, and here I brought up age because I was supposed to talk about social inequalities, and we can also bring up age, which is an important category when you look into small-scale farming and production. So you can say, okay, let's identify. And now I move from maybe more the macro and aggregate view that we had in previous presentations to the more local. And you can actually ask the question, who is the responsible producer here? And who has access to information, education for how to proceed with production in times of climate change and climate change variability? So identify who that person is, age, gender, so on. And also you can say that cash crop production is often more associated with men. And the closer the food production is to your mouth and to the household, the more women seem to be involved. So women often produce in their gardens and produce directly for subsistence and directly for the household. But if there's a surplus, they can also sell at the market. But will there in any sense be a shift between the two? Because it's often seen that cash crop production is associated with higher income. And if women are supposed to also raise their income, or if you search for a more equal distribution of income opportunities and income in the household, how can there be a shift? Can there be a shift? What do you need to do? Is it a matter again of recoding the labor division, or recoding of what's feminine and what's masculine? So you might here touch upon some very firmly rooted norms and values in people's interaction, actually. Also look at land rights, division of labor and bargaining power, and diversification. How do age and gender matter here? So not only do we see gender as relational between men and women, you can also see between groups of women, or women of different age might have different power, for example, in the household, have different bargaining power, whether you have to adhere to a father, to a husband, or maybe to another male relative if you're a widow, and so on. Often your power would increase with age, but sometimes also at a certain point in time, if you become a widow, you will lose some of that power. So look at the land rights. So even if you see that women produce maybe more than 50% of the agriculture production, they may not, or they might not in that situation own the actual land. Right, another could be food production in relation to the SDGs. What is the picture and what are the potentials for agriculture? So, I mean, you also brought up aspects of food in the previous presentations. And I think I here have a slide which just shows the complexities. So I will not go into this, but I'll just show the complexities. So here you have all the SDGs listed, all the SDGs that make sense in relation to agriculture, and then we have pointed out which ones are more important than others. So it shows the complexity of the food system, but it also shows the potential of agriculture. So if you, through agriculture production, or how you organize production, food security, food sovereignty, you may also, with that as an entry point, also be able to maybe address, tackle, solve other issues, other problems. So that's sort of the complexity of it that we shouldn't forget. And when it comes to gender, we shouldn't read through all this, but I mean, just to take up a few examples of how gender matters for small-scale farming, we can just look at the few of them here. So you might think that small-scale farming is a simple thing, but once you start studying in more detail, you realize that this is a very complex system where you combine various types of practices and activities. There's seasonality going into it. You often have to diversify out of agriculture. And it's truly gendered, very gendered. So many of these tasks, as I mentioned, are very gendered. So weeding, for example, is a woman's task, and often children. And so it's very gendered too. We can also take another one of the yellow ones, the perceptions, women as resourceful agents or vulnerable victims. How should we see them in times of climate change? So if men and women are in a sense suffering equally in households that are poor or are exposed to multiple stresses, if you deconstruct, as many have done, feminists, even Sen did it, if you deconstruct the household and look within, what do you see? Do you see resourceful agents, or do you see vulnerable victims? Can we identify this according to gender lines? And is also very practical for policymakers, often to sometimes refer to women as vulnerable victims that need to be protected. And at some points, it's also very practical to see them as resourceful agents. Women should solve the question. They should solve the fertility question. They should produce food for the household and whatever. So sometimes you see them as agents. So instead of maybe ending up in this firm dichotomy, you should also deconstruct it and look at it more from a complex view. When it comes to rights, I just mentioned very briefly the land rights. So they might be customary, or they might be statutory, or in combination. So they are also very complex often. Who owns the land? How can it be inherited? Does it have to go through the chief? Does it go according to kin and family lines? Or how can it be used and inherited and controlled? And then also when it comes to social goal setting, we have the SDGs. And it's often said from an economic point of view that including everyone is, it's a matter of equality and justice and human rights maybe, but it's also a matter of efficiency and equity. So growth rates or development or improvement in well-being would often be more efficient if everyone is more involved and also is offered more opportunities. So in development, we used to talk about efficiency and equity, and now with climate change, we also talk about environmental justice, which also shows that these issues of inequality, which were really the origin of development project, are still there, and they're becoming more and more complex also with climate change, and we call it now environmental justice. So it has to be seen also in this long-term debate. Right, so if we move on to, so I just wanted to also say that there is an opportunity for social change. So we're not all stuck, it's not all fixed. So in times of change, there can also be historical changes, like for example, changes of gender task and the recoding of things. So I just wanted to remind us about that. But when it comes to the question then, so the research or the impact here. So I think for climate change and food and gender, these might not be new to anyone, but I think maybe they deserve to be reiterated. So, and it was also mentioned here by previous speakers. So take an interdisciplinary and integrated approach, since many of these problems, as we said, are complex, they are multiple stresses. So I think we need to be interdisciplinary, and for speaking to this audience about this might be to, preach to the choir. Ask also both theoretically significant and empirically relevant questions, because sometimes we end up in very empirical cases one after the other, and nobody's really there to draw the general conclusions or synthesize these empirical field studies. So they are very important and very essential, but we also need to bring up how we can theorize from it, because from theory we can then increase the understanding of what's going on really. So not only adding one empirical case to another, but also really drawing theoretical insights from it and move forward theoretically, so the next empirical case can be maybe formulated in a more insightful way. Work on several fronts with actors, structures, and institutions. So I think that's also important. So don't be too focused on only actors, see their context, the structures, and also the institutions, how they are changing. And as we know, institutions are often very sticky. It's difficult to change institutions, especially if they are norm-based and also deeply rooted and associated with whatever culture. But we need to observe them, and we need to maybe look at them, revisit them, and also maybe reformulate them. Reframe conventional questions, because how people understand the problem determines how they act on it. So we can't just assume and take for granted that this is the way we should approach a question. We should also see it from the point of view of those who are involved in a problem. So when we bring a problem to a setting, we might realize that this problem is actually not a priority problem, or not even a problem at all. Or maybe it's could be reframed into something which is more adequate for that particular and appropriate for that particular setting. So if, for example, according to agriculture or agroforestry, you can say not the jargon, but the narrative around agroforestry is that farmers should plant trees, because there's so many benefits from this. You can increase your income, you can use them for all sorts of improvements in the household and in farming, and it can also, you can use it for CO2 for mitigation, and you can use it as a sink in that sense. So there's so many benefits from planting trees. So if farmers don't plant trees, you might think we have to go and see why don't they plant trees? But instead you can shift the focus a little bit and see, they actually know a lot about trees. They know about agroforestry, but what's in it for them? Maybe they have other priorities. Maybe they need to put food on the table, might need to address gender issues, might need to do other things. And agroforestry is also a very, very long-term issue to tend to. There can be many risks involved during the way. You can lose the small plants, your neighbor's goats can come by and eat and whatever. So many risks involved. So even if farmers are knowledgeable and know all the benefits about trees, they might still not go ahead with it, because they are inhibited in one way or the other. And you need to find out why and how that is. And you can study how food production is organized, managed, and controlled, and again, gendered. So now I stressed this gendering many times, but I think it's very important to realize how gendered actually this complex small-scale farming setting and context is, and also how food is flowing from, depending on if you own or not own the resources, how you can actually manage and organize your work, if you can benefit from technology improvements or education or whatever, and in what ways these are gendered, and if they can be, regendered in some way. And then I think we all have assumptions. We all bring assumptions, empirical, theoretical, positionality, whatever. But I think it's important to try to take a non-essentialist approach. And one way to do that is, of course, to shift your perspective between different theories, try another approach, try another theory next time, and also this degree of reflexivity that we often call for example, in sustainability science. Right, so I think that was it.
Great, thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking. Loved the paintings at the beginning, and loved the questions that you set us on a number of topics. I'm going to move straight on to the last presentation, which is the one on climate change and conflict. And we'll have a space for discussion of your presentation in a short while. So I'll hand over to Tilman Broek and Uche Okpara to present on climate change and conflict.
Thank you very much, John. As you say, I'll co-present with Uche, and I'll now share my screen. And I will now start the presentation. And please let me know if that doesn't, now it seems to work. Okay, thank you very much. So what a hard act to follow. We have a prepared presentation, but I would like to say very briefly that much of what Uche and I are about to say about the importance of conflict in the context of climate change, climate variability, agriculture, and food security has actually already been said by Anne, except she said it about climate change, and I hope, and gender, both of which are very cross-cutting themes. And the issue of violent conflict, state fragility, and sort of institutional weakness is likewise extremely cross-cutting. And often it is my role in a sort of group of people with different research interests and different topics to put it in a sort of econometric way to warn about the omitted variable bias. Yeah, that we saw earlier, I think in Alex's presentation, the number of food insecure people in Africa is going to rise dramatically. It's going to rise around the world, but especially in Africa, particularly large. And Africa actually does have a lot of violent conflict, a lot of fragility, a lot of weak institutions. And so, these things are at least correlated. And so we want to explore a little bit in this presentation how they're correlated and what that might mean for our research agenda. So first of all, why is this a priority research area? Well, actually, I think I've answered that, but I do have a few slides anyway. Climate change matters. A violent conflict, weak state institutions, and state fragility, I'll use these terms loosely and inaccurately, somewhat interchangeably, also matters. And what we are arguing is that food security is not just a driver or an outcome of each of these issues, but it's also sort of a mechanism. It's something that holds or that connects these issues, and it's something that can help explain these outcomes in different ways. And the literatures on these different connections has advanced at different speeds. Sorry, just to also add that, of course, climate action, it's an SDG. We saw that in the round circular picture from Anne earlier. But there is the issue of SDG 16, and I think it's one of these important cross-cutting ones, but often neglected. That also matters, and they both matter a lot for zero hunger or food insecurity, and indeed for agriculture, which of course is also closely intertwined with zero hunger. So we do know that climate change and climate risks and climate shocks can shape food insecurity. We know that food insecurity can shape behavior which is relevant for climate change. Yeah, deforestation, for example, as an extreme survival tactic of those who are looking for livelihoods. We also know that weak institutions are not good for climate change and can accelerate it. We know relatively less about how food security and weak institutions are interrelated. We know it's a circular thing. In fact, there was a recent State of Food Insecurity report about 2 years ago from FAO and other agencies, which looked exactly at this nexus. And I contributed to that report as the lead consultant. And we looked at the interrelations between these two topics, and we found it's not really well understood, especially if you go down to the micro level and the local level. But furthermore, we don't understand either how sort of the climate action and climate change plays into this. So there's a lot of connections that are likely to be important, but perhaps not so well understood. And what we are arguing is that both climate change and state fragility can act as mutually reinforcing threat multipliers. So making things a lot worse. For lack of a better term, we called it here long-run food insecurity traps. You could also say that they are cycles of dependencies or really difficult situations to escape from, especially if you think about the individuals, in, say, the Sahel zone who are faced, with physical insecurity, with rapidly changing environments and poor livelihoods in traditional agricultural ways.
Tillman, we are seeing sort of the preview of your next few slides as well as.
Oh, that's annoying. Okay, then can I flip the screens? Does that?
I think that's better. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. I didn't realize that it projected only one of these two. Okay, then you have seen this intriguing comment about the great big clap. I've no idea where that came from. Anyway, so the discussion is, so what I want to discuss very, very briefly is that these are global challenges. These are challenges which are sort of, if I can put it like that, universal. But as I've started stressing several times, the national, local, and individual context really matter and need to be explicitly accounted for as well. Secondly, we're talking a lot about individual outcomes at the welfare level and at the behavior level. I explicitly put here between, but also within households to recognize the importance of gender issues here. So the behaviors by men and women may differ because they face different constraints, not just in terms of climate change and in terms of, but also in terms of institutions and insecurity. And so there are a whole range of knowledge gaps, which are in a sense summarized by the red arrows, which I had before, and which I don't want to go in too much. But I think for lack of time, but I think my broad theme is that there are these interdependencies which are not well understood, and these webs of relationships. And if we omit the whole sort of conflict and institutional angle, then we probably don't understand the overall picture very well. The other point I want to make here is the knowledge gap in non-extreme settings. So sometimes, a lot of people study places where it's really dire, like, maybe Somalia, for example. But there are places where low-level insecurity and sort of normal weak institutions also play a role, and where maybe some people are particularly excluded from achieving food security. And I think that's actually numerically maybe also a very important setting. It's not just the very extreme settings where things go either really well or really badly, but it's also the in-between areas where probably the majority of people are suffering, but are suffering unobserved. And all of this requires careful measurement and better data and better interpretation. Just very briefly, some examples of how this can play out. My own research on this has been, for example, on Kyrgyzstan using long-term panel data, where we showed that cold shocks, which I thought was nice as opposed to drought and heat, which we often look at when we look at climate change. But an occurrence of frequent and severe cold shocks has a severe negative impact on child health, especially young children. Among people in Kyrgyzstan, there's a lot of livestock rearing. And so, of course, if the livestock suffer as a result of long winters and short summers, then it has an impact on child health. And this shows how severe this problem is. Up to about 25 or 30% are moderately or severely stunted in Kyrgyzstan. However, we also see, and that's something that I don't explicitly say here, but what we found in our ongoing work, the institutions also matter. So, for example, if your institutions are weak and you cut off from electricity, that makes it even worse for the children that suffer these cold shocks. Here's an example from Northeast Nigeria, where we looked at the impact of conflict on food security outcomes measured by the food consumption score. Now, a lot of the people, basically everybody in Northeast Nigeria is somehow conflict affected, but some of them are particularly affected either because they're displaced, in which case they have lower food consumption scores, or because they experience different degrees of conflict intensity. And those that experience on the right here, extreme conflict, are the ones which are and do not receive any assistance, which is, you could argue, is an institutional channel, are particularly badly off. The good news being that if they do receive assistance, they're actually borderline off, which is sort of, you know, somewhat okay compared to being poorly off. So the interplay of aid and institutions on the one hand, but the insecurity on the other hand, really shapes food security outcomes here in this case of Northeast Nigeria. And a final example how rural institutions can be hugely varied and different. This is an example of a survey of horticultural farmers in Kenya. Kenya has suffered a lot from political violence, as we know. And these farmers have very different views of different dimensions of institutions, depending whether they are a central authority, the blue line, or local authority institutions, the orangish, reddish line. And basically, while central institutions are very powerful, they don't really help. They don't give assistance to these households, these farming households. And I'm sure that shapes their decision, their farming decisions, and what they can do for the national economy, but also for their own food security. So institutions have a huge role to play in achieving food security outcomes. And I would like to hand over to Uche for his part of the presentation.
Thank you, Timan. So I will talk us through what I believe are the most important research questions in climate change and conflict studies. Now, first, why do we have so many controversies in climate and conflict research? And do modeling and data choices sway conclusions? What theories stand out? And what are the main interests of policymakers in climate change and conflict relations? Next slide, please. So the debate on climate and conflict is highly polarized. One highly influential paper in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences says that warming increases the risk of civil war in Africa. Another influential paper in the same journal rebuffed this claim, saying climate is not to be blamed for civil war in Africa. And yet another popular paper clarifies that modeling and data choices sway conclusions about climate and conflict relations. So in my research, I find 4 areas where we might begin to resolve the controversies that characterize climate and conflict relation. First is context specificity. Second is clear specification of the causal mechanisms. And third is paying more attention to spatial temporal resolutions, especially around issues on scale dynamics and speed over effect. And then fourth is to ensure we use standardized measures and to also derive reliable metrics for the factors that we integrate into conflict and climate analysis. So we need to improve the evidence base by increasing dialogue between researchers who are using different approaches. Next slide, please. So why should climate change, whether in the context of resource scarcity or abundance, be associated with conflict and violence? So what are the key theories underpinning the research in this field? For example, considering the motivation of individuals and communities and the strategies of armed groups. And there are a lot of questions that could arise from these different theoretical ideas around deprivation, grievances, greed, solidarity, opportunity, and constraint. So we might want to ask, are individuals and communities often motivated to fight when they experience deprivation? And what role can greed and grievances play at individual and community level in increasing the risk of conflict under climate extremes? And what examples of natural resource dependent communities that have succeeded in reducing the risk of conflict under climate extremes do we have? There are so many communities who have been able to innovate and to build community around the crisis they face. What lessons can we learn from such communities? And how can we use that to inform the theory around climate and conflict? So climate shock, like we know in so many poor countries, can facilitate opportunities for the formation of rebel groups, as well as opportunities for recruitment of fighters. So how do grievances, and opportunity to recruit fighters lead to the formation of conflict economies? In so many places in Africa currently, we are seeing evidence of conflict economies driving conflicts. You know, in the Lake Chad Basin area, for example, rebel groups are creating different systems to drive conflict. And these systems are embedded in what is called conflict economies. And we are finding the government around the Lake Chad Basin area, for example, is finding it so difficult to dismantle this conflict economy, basically because we are yet to understand the dynamics of conflict economy. So how will climate pose a constraint to conflict escalation in places experiencing ongoing conflict? For example, when logistics are affected or rebel camps are destroyed and infrastructures are damaged by flood. Next slide, please. So in developing new theories, we should also be thinking of how we are engaging with policymakers. Are we engaging enough? And how do we influence policy when decision makers are based in other countries? I think there's an urgent need to change the culture of climate, conflict, and food security research, for example, by focusing on action-oriented research, building communities, bringing science, society, and the state together to address the protracted conflict that climate change drive in several areas. Over to you, slides. Over to you, Timan.
Okay, thank you. The third part of our talk is how we can do the research with impact. I put the emphasis here on the we as opposed to the priority or the impact. But I think many of our conclusions echo what has been said before. So I really want to shorten this a lot. And I think we do need multidisciplinary research. We need to utilize partnerships. We need long-term commitment, because these processes that we want to study don't just evolve suddenly or come to an end quickly. We need to bridge the research policy divide. But I think in many ways, these are things which NRI is really well placed to do. And so I think we can build on our strengths in all these areas. I also think from what follows from that is that we must be more strategic in our approach and building large-scale research programs rather than sort of, chasing smaller individual grants. And I think one thing that we should be doing, and where we are very well placed with our partners in Africa and elsewhere to do so, is to track the long-term changes in climate change, in food security, and in state fragility across Africa, especially at the micro level, and collecting this multidisciplinary data and analyzing it in a sort of multi-topic way and in partnership with our partners. So I think there is a great opportunity for us to leverage our strengths, and I hope that this conference can be part of moving that agenda forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tilman and Uche. Some very interesting points raised there. I'm going to hand over to June Po, who provides some remarks, mainly on the gender paper. I'm afraid that Dr. Eria Onyango has been unable to connect to us. I think this is election-related internet problems in Uganda. So we're unlikely to have a discussant on conflict. If time allows, I may say a few words myself, but over to June.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentations, and for Professor Morton for inviting me to be a discussant in this session. I'm a research fellow on gender and diversity in food systems at NRI. And I'd like to spend a few minutes to reflect on Professor Yannick's presentation and writing, linking gender, climate change, and development in sub-Saharan African small-scale farming contexts. And hopefully this will pose a few questions that can spark more discussion later. It's not, oh. So Professor Yannick has clearly laid out why this nexus is a priority in research and captured some of the complexities when multiple stressors interact and converge. So I'd like to focus my reflections on the second and third questions. What are the most important research questions? How can we do the research in a way which has impact, and with whom? To set the scene, Professor Yannick reminded us in her paper, Taking Gender Seriously in Climate Change Adaptation and Sustainability Science Research, that people, places, and production contributing to the least to climate change will suffer the most. And while that may be a reason to focus on small-scale farmers as victims, but like many of us here know, they may also be actors making small changes with big impact collectively. At the same time, taking an integrative, multi-scalar approach to our research means not to lose sight of the powerful actors also driving climate change. Large investments in agricultural expansion and deforestation, food industries and businesses that have the leverage to introduce just labor and environmental practices and safety standards. Professor Yannick's presentation also clearly draw links between climate change, gender inequality, and food systems. All these large topics together challenges us to recognize that a problem has to be posed big enough in order to accommodate a solution. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if we fail to define the problem big enough, then many important aspects and impacts on a variable coming from outside the domain of the problem will be treated often as random, as error, or even as cultural context. That's why I really agree with Professor Yannick's next point that social conditions and social relations are, although historically reinforced, they are not fixed. They are transformable, especially seeing now during the pandemic, work, education, care responsibilities from home, and movement restrictions have drastically shifted gender practices. A question on our mind is, what kind of normal do we want to return to? More specifically, two important and related questions that Professor Yannick posed. How can cash crop production, often done by men, shift to women? And how food production and agriculture in relation to sustainable development goals? What is the picture? And what are the potentials of agriculture? Here, I would like to bring also one of Professor Yannick's cautions in her paper in Sustainability Science and invite us to discuss later this notion of growth, labeled as inclusive pro-poor growth, or in our case here, inclusive pro-gender equality growth. And she wrote, inclusive pro-poor growth is key to social change, but that must be further scrutinized in light of climate change impacts and responses. She also hinted at conceptual shifts that needs to happen in order to achieve research impact. For example, seeing women or men from victims to agents and entrepreneurs to actors in a global care chain. To me, that resonates clearly in the contemporary African food systems. Though inequalities are pervasive, for example, when women and children have acceptable roles as caretakers of small livestock, but are deemed in some culture as unacceptable recipients to consume chicken that is served to the gods. And that comes from a discussion yesterday in the session on food systems for improved nutrition. Yet, in this framing, we're still seeing women and children as victims. So how can we as researchers begin to rethink and redesign our research where women and men are part of this global care chain, putting care rights and responsibilities in the center of global food systems functioning? And also, as Professor Olsen noted, food sovereignty argues for alternative norms of care rights and responsibilities with relation to nature and society. So Professor Yannick explained the gender-laden norms that influence productive, reproductive, and discursive rights and responsibilities will really influence our understanding and our decisions and actions in our work for climate change adaptation, development, and transformation of our food system. She also highlighted that in order to do research with impact, it needs us to ask both theoretically significant and empirically relevant questions. And I would reinforce her message with an advice I was given by Richard Levins, an ex-tropical farmer turned ecologist, biomathematician, and philosopher. Here, I paraphrase, he said, to pick a research question, consider three things: that it is intellectually stimulating, socially useful, and with people you love. So to me, it means we as researchers are socially embedded beings in society, which Pamela in her presentation also shown in the research impact models. Not only our research output has impact, but also our decisions of whom we do research with, what and how we do the research could also be making waves. It resonates with Professor Yannick's paper on what about gender in climate change, where she takes an integrated interdisciplinary approach to bring critical lenses to understand climate change adaptation and sustainability science. Not to just criticize or pick apart other people's work, but to bring lessons on gender, politics, and power from development discourse and political ecology into climate change research, and work with the next generation of researchers to learn how to better reframe these important questions. So thank you very much for this opportunity to learn more about your work and share some of my reflections here.
Thank you very much for those comments, June, and very heartening to see your comments about people we love there. A word we don't often use in development or climate change discussions. Yeah, unfortunately, Ariel Onyango has not been able to connect. I'll just say a few things about the conflict paper. Two things that struck me were the mention of conflict economies, definitely a very important issue for discussion at various geographical scales, and also Tillman's mention of the non-extreme cases. I think also very important to look at cases of low-level conflict. And I'm very pleased to say we have with us Betty Nakiru, who is an NRI PhD student working in Karamoja, which is a very long-running but conflict or sets of conflicts, but certainly not something that makes headlines outside Uganda. I hope maybe Betty can contribute during the facilitated session that follows. My other reflection is how much Tillman and Uche's presentation directed us to matters of theory, and I think in conflict even more than some of these other subtopics, we're directed towards the questions of correlation versus causation. What do we see as the nature of explanation? How do we explain conflict? What role do we give to the agency, not just of those who survive conflicts, but those who fight and take an active role in them? And how can climate and weather act not just as constraints on conflict, but also as resources to conflict, where it seems in some cases unusually wet or unusually clement years may be as much a trigger to conflict as drought years. But I'll leave my comments there, and I will hand over now to Valerie and Richard to start off on the facilitated session. I'll beg your indulgence to let the session as a whole run about 15 minutes over if everybody's happy. We do understand if people have other things to go to. So handing over to Valerie.
Okay, thanks, John. So we've now got about 50 minutes or so, or sorry, 40 minutes. There's an opportunity to widen out this discussion. And in doing that, I think perhaps just to sort of bring us back to the central question that this session is trying to address, of how can research contribute to tackling the climate emergency in food and agricultural systems up to 2030. And hence the emphasis on not just what research, but also how we do the research, to linking up to the impact idea. So what we'd like to do is to spend maybe 20, 25 minutes of the time on the what, which Valerie's sharing in the table here, which is capturing the various ideas that came from the presentations themselves, but also the contributions that have come through the chat window to add to the research areas and research questions that we could be considering under this theme. And then we'll spend, I say maybe 10 or 50 minutes, depending on how the sessions go, on the how. How can we better achieve impact with this research? So to do this, I'd welcome, this is the opportunity now perhaps to go beyond, please contribute either through the chat window, or if you would like to raise a point, then please just raise the hand and we can bring you in to the discussion. So you can perhaps, I hope you can read, I know it's a bit of a tight squeeze there with the window, but maybe if we could perhaps start off with the food security area. Any additions to that, any amendments that you'd like to suggest around that area of climate change and food security? Any initial comments, please, or suggestions? Any further comments or suggestions? I don't know whether, maybe just as a sort of a potential prompt, is there a feeling at all there that these research areas sufficiently go into the biophysical aspects of climate change? Maybe just as a prompt, maybe? Anything on the biophysical side that people feel could be brought in more? Possible links with the sustainable intensification work that was discussed yesterday? Okay, maybe I'm going to, perhaps if I could invite this area of research and how it brings about change with farmers. One of the areas that came up, perhaps that hasn't come up there, is how is this research actually going to link with farmers? Was anybody like to perhaps comment on that area at all? Right, Fiona, thank you.
Hi, and hi everyone. Sorry, I was a bit late, well, quite a bit late actually, so I'm a bit worried about making any contributions because I did miss the presentations, but thankfully I had seen them as John had sent them to me yesterday. I just wanted to add, I had that point that you've just mentioned about the link to farmers. Obviously that's really sort of critical because I thought that was a bit missing in relation to the impact. They was talking about sort of government and the private sector. If we want to see change on the ground and we have to really sort of work with organisations who know farmers, who have a lot of experience of working with farmers, and because change does take time and it's difficult to to persuade people to change and to work together on how best to change, because a lot of it is very context specific, isn't it? But I wanted to raise another issue actually in relation to food security, which I felt was missing a bit from the discussion, and it was more about the, Harry said that it was partly raised in the discussion in terms of food prices and trade, but I thought there could be more on the political economy. So I think that could be something that could come out more in that subtopic on how the political economy affects access to food prices, etc., and how subsidies, how decisions elsewhere affect the decisions of farmers and how they conduct agriculture.
Okay, Richard, thanks. And I've just put a comment in the chat to everyone. It seems we have quite a compartmentalized approach here of lots of different research areas. And we've had a lot of discussion in the very interesting presentations about the causal interconnections between high-level issues, land, water, climate change, food security, nutrition, the role of gender, the role of conflict in this process, understanding the causal connections and the leverages for action. We had one presentation on the landscape approach, and what I'd like to raise is to return to that slightly, not so much as landscapes as an object of inquiry, but the possibility of adopting an increasing empirical focus on specific landscapes and territories where our partners are active as a means to combine, let's say, more holistic interdisciplinary research, which starts from all of these topics, food security, nutrition, gender, conflict, et cetera, but has an increasingly integrative focus, an increasingly increased engagement with stakeholders within particular landscapes and territories. Would this not provide a means of achieving greater impact and getting greater understanding of the causal connections, both in terms of the origins of problems and the nature of solutions, by working on a more concrete basis with partners in particular regions, territories in the longer term? So that's my question. Rather than thinking about what are the gaps between the huge wide range of issues, what are the issues we've not yet identified in water or land or food or nutrition or gender, but really to look at the connections on a concrete real world basis. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Julian. This idea of perhaps working in a geographical area, having a geographical focus, which I think a number of, for example, the CG centres have moved to an approach of trying to focus their research geographically as well as around certain themes. Yes, I guess that's part of, that's, as you say, cross-cutting, addressing the how as much as the what. And that's certainly an interesting idea to suggest there. Okay, thanks. So maybe sort of throwing it open beyond the food security theme, across the other themes overall, and possibly, are there any areas that people perhaps feel, are there major emission areas around this question of how can research contribute to tackling climate emergency and food and agricultural systems? So we had quite a long list of possible additional aspects there. Social and environmental impacts of regional economic arrangements in Africa, environmental justice, climate justice, scrutiny of pro-poor growth, timescales for implementation, institutions and approaches to local stakeholder capacity to respond to climate change. So maybe it would be useful to go to the how question, because a lot of this seems to be moving towards the how as much as the what is the subject area. There's a huge range of subject areas, I guess, but given the urgency of the situation, maybe we could move towards the how. And there's a wide range of suggestions here about perhaps what could be done, and how the research could be done, ranging from the idea of needing to be demand-driven, stronger partnerships, interdisciplinarity, multi-scale, transdisciplinarity, looking beyond the research itself, but looking at research governance systems. So how is the whole research process, does that need revisiting maybe? How do we engage with the private sector, private industry? How do we engage with policymakers? How do we scale up? And then the issue again from the conflict debate around needing to improve dialogue between researchers themselves around conflict to try to come to some perhaps a better understanding of what the issues are and how the issues can be addressed, even amongst researchers alone, let alone the other stakeholders. Do we need to reframe some of the conventional questions? And bringing in June's point about who we work with, should we only work with the ones we love, or is it perhaps also important to work with the ones we don't love so much? Yeah, any comments, please, suggestions?
Yes, thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah,
on that. Yeah, so as you just alluded, the problems we're seeking to address are multi-dimensional, whether it's the impacts of climate change or the responses to climate change in terms of managing water or forests and landscapes, and the forest agriculture interface in landscapes, dietary challenges, displaced peoples, etc. All those any response to any of those problems is always multi-objective and multi-dimensional in terms of its impacts. And so we need to, I guess, as a sort of a research area, but it's also part of the how, is that we need to better understand what kinds of processes and tools and models and what are their strengths and weaknesses in terms of supporting the decision-making in these multi-objective decision-making and outcome processes. And obviously part of that is multidisciplinarity on the academic side, but then also, of course, bringing in the non-academic knowledge and experience. And that's been recognized from the point of view of incorporation of local knowledge. Perhaps how effective is still to be seen, but also as you've just perhaps alluding to, we also need to bring in the knowledge and experience of businesses and markets as also important and critical actors in those in that multi-decision making, but always recognizing obviously there's different strengths between the actors in these decision-making processes, and that they will be holding different values. And the decisions that are taken are going to be as much determined by the values of those present as the evidence which they're looking at.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So that whole area of research, as well as actually the doing of how you do the research, yeah, fitting into both categories. Yeah, okay, thanks. Leonard, please.
Yes, I think that reframing as a methodological approach can be very, very efficient. And then that should be connected with the question about what is necessary, what is sufficient. So for example, if we take a group of people studying the we call it African food crisis, the physical geographer will look at the place and say, oh, it's something about the soils and the vegetation and the water management. The human geographer would say that it's something about the institutions and the division of labor. The sociologist would say that it's something about the power structure. The economist would say that it's the market access. And of course, all these are right to some extent. They're all necessary, but they are sort of how much is sufficient to actually have a meaningful answer to the real problem. So therefore, I think reframing is as an approach, a systematic approach, can be very useful. And sometimes we have to push ourselves because, of course, with the disciplinary training we have, also comes these blinders, so that we are trained to look at the soil if we are physical geographer. We are trained to look at gender roles if we are sociologists. We are trained to look at the markets only if we are economists. So this, I think, sort of reframing is a powerful approach.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks. Just looking in the chat window, I see a couple of comments from Nikki. One addressing perhaps the issue that one about reflection of research priorities, but also I think you comment here about engagement, multiple stakeholders may produce holistic solutions, but does this delay research focus and implementation? Could you perhaps expand a bit on that, Nikki, sorry.
Hi there.
Yeah.
I'm Nikki. I'm from Rothamsted Research here. This is very much of, I mean, I think the ideal is to engage with as many stakeholders as possible to reach a solution from a challenge that's occurring. But I find that stakeholders will have different priorities and will lead the research in different areas, in different ways. And this can make everything very confusing and basically delay any implementation or any meaningful solution coming out. I think in the ideal world, you would engage with as many stakeholders as possible, but I don't think this necessarily helps move research on all the time. Sorry, I've got a dog barking in the background.
Dog agrees. Okay, thanks. And I see Anne has a suggestion, perhaps. Could you expand on what you mean by clumsy solutions?
Yeah, I just mentioned it.
Yeah.
It comes from Mary Douglas, where she sees that, I mean, we will always have different positions and perspectives and whatever. But if you get together and realize that that's a starting point, it's difficult to reach consensus perhaps, but as a starting point, people have these different positions and perspectives, and you can still come up with some kind of agreement around a certain thing. It might not be perfect from anyone's view, but it's still one way of actually addressing most of the important aspects of a certain problem. So she writes about this, and it's called clumsy solutions. So it comes out of cultural theory, and I think it has been used by, maybe it was brought up also by Mike Hume in the context of sustainability and climate change. So I haven't revisited for some time. I just came to think of it in this context.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I think that's really helpful. I think this...
John might know more. I mean, she's
yes.
was an anthropologist, so John might know more about this.
I don't. I only came across the terminology a couple of weeks ago, actually, so I can't add very much.
Okay, but I think that's certainly something to explore, because it does seem that this is a constant dilemma between the engagement with diverse stakeholders, the time that takes, and people wanting to move forward quickly. And this is a constant area of tension, I think, in terms of these multi-stakeholder processes. So ideas on how to address that, and maybe these clumsy solutions, maybe this could offer some interesting ideas. Yeah. Okay. Quick scan of comments. Tim, your suggestion here about the variability within Africa, it's not all necessarily negative, I think is one of your points. And how should our various research focus perhaps reflect that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that there's a tendency to focus on very fragile areas for good reason, but there might also be an argument for directing resources to the more favorable areas in order to try to maximize production from those, provided there are systems to allocate food more equally. And that's a big ask, but it was just really a sort of thinking aloud a little bit about how we're prioritizing resources, both for research and for wider, planning processes.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tim. And maybe possibly linked to that, Kate, your point about institutions and approaches linking to local stakeholder capacity. To some extent, that's perhaps a related point. How do you prioritize where you do your research, but how do you also prioritize strengthening capacity? I just want to, Betty, if you're still there, Betty, was your point about trees? About trees, planting trees, and actually then looking after trees. Would you like to expand that a little?
Lucy's point, wasn't it?
Okay.
Whose point was it, sorry?
Lucy's point, I thought, but... But if anybody would like to say a few words on trees, both trees in forests and trees in fields.
There was the point about, well, it could, yes, that's one point, but also the point about it's not just the planting of trees, but it's what happens after the trees are planted, which I think which perhaps could lead into a wider point.
Oh, yeah. No.
Hello.
Hello, yeah.
Yeah, good evening. It's 5 o'clock in Uganda.
Oh, okay.
Actually, it is 6 p.m.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Environmental-wise, Karamoja is one region that has been planting trees for a very long time. And the question and the issue was that these trees never saw their first birthday. And the question was why? So we realized that people just planted trees for the sake of it as an accountability. So the norm was changed from tree planting to tree growing. And with the concept of tree growing, we see a tree being planted today and nurtured over a period of time until the time it bears fruit. So it gave a thinking to the community that it's not just about planting a tree, but nurturing it to the time when you reap its dividends. So when we say we would like to invest more in tree planting, it's like just the act of planting a tree and you leave it there. But when you talk about growing, it's like you have to nurture and take care of it for such a long time. So that is the direction we are moving in the Karamoja region.
Okay, thanks, Betty. I mean, that does kind of remind me of this wider point about measuring success in terms of how you do address climate. And many initiatives seem to focus, as this sort of example you're talking about, they focus on whether an activity occurs rather than what actually happens afterwards. And that does seem to be a very crucial point in terms of sort of development initiatives to strengthen adaptive capacity around climate. If anyone perhaps like to take that forward a little at all, or moving discussion elsewhere?
I could perhaps say something on the tree growing. I completely agree. Mm-hmm. Not a matter really of just planting the trees, but the big thing is to grow them, actually. So what we also saw when we studied this in Kenya was, so you plant a tree, but then you reap the fruits so much into the future. It's such a long-term project. You don't even know if you will be around. If you're in a context with HIV/AIDS, for example, would you know that you are around when you can reap the fruits of those trees? And we also took it from the perspective of the farmers and from the perspective of the big organizations. And we compared that. I mean, we really compared ontology and epistemology. What do you know about trees? And how do you see trees? What's the functioning of trees? And also then finding out that farmers are very knowledgeable about what trees can do in terms of fruits and fibers and shade and religious aspects or whatever, and for environmental protection and all that. But it's just such a big and risky undertaking that might inhibit the whole project. So growing trees that's a good shift. So shift from planting to actually growing and looking after.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Anne. In some parts of Africa, what I'm seeing is that actually there's almost too many trees. In parts of Tanzania, in the Southern Highlands, people are starting to get concerned that there's such a market for trees for construction and so on, that it's actually taking up land for food. And in Ethiopia, something similar seems to be happening in parts of the country. So this balance between, trees and can trees also contribute to food security in some form? And the different uses of trees, as well as the ecosystem services they provide, does seem to is likely to become more and more important area, I think, to look at trees in different biophysical and socioeconomic circumstances.
Hello, excuse me.
Yeah, Alio, yeah.
Yeah, I have tried to see the raising hand icon, but I couldn't see it. Sorry about that. Actually, I just want to respond to the issue of growing planted trees.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, it is not only about growing or planting trees, but I think I put a question there: which trees? We need trees definitely, but I think in Africa we need to emphasize planting and restoring indigenous tree species. In most cases, most of the reforestation and afforestation projects focus on planting of exotic species, in which you spend, in some cases, I know in Nigeria, I have spoken with some people who were engaged in such projects for decades. And from their experiences, 70% of the expenditure on tree replantation campaigns are being expended on infrastructure and raising seedlings. Whereas in the case of indigenous trees, it is much easier, you don't need that. And in particular, I think there is a proposal that we are working on what a colleague of mine calls undergraduate forest. And in that concept or idea of underground forest, we are talking about tree saplings that grew naturally in our farmlands, where bigger trees were, cut down. But at the same time, because they are locals, they are always willing to come back. It's like they are appealing to people, let us grow, leave us to re-emerge again. So I think focus should always try to be on replanting or restoring in indigenous species. I think I led a project on that a few years ago where we tried to restore trees, because it happens in the city where I am right now, speaking right away. Most of the neighborhoods in the old city are named after indigenous tree species, and they help a lot with food security. They provide people with necessary nutrients, but I realized that if you ask most of the children in such communities, do you know the tree? Have you ever seen the tree named after your community? The answer is always no, I don't know this tree. Oh, is this a tree? So I led a project in which we tried to restore some of these indigenous tree species into localities of such areas within the city and its periphery. So I think it is critically important if we can find ways of prioritizing restoration of indigenous tree species. Not only that they help in climate adaptation, but as well for improving local food security, including indigenous sources of nutrition, which we know one of the challenges, of course, I have pinned down some of the issues when we finally come for discussions. So we definitely need more attention, more focus on indigenous tree restoration as a strategy for improving food and nutritional security in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aljo. That's a really interesting area, I think. I was trying to think of a way to link that with another topic that's come up through the chat. I don't know how easy or difficult that would be. Do you see a link between the indigenous trees and business? Because this whole area of how to engage with business, but at the same time with local knowledge and local systems, is that any thoughts?
I don't know. I think we published a paper on the Taylor and Francis journal Cities and Health recently. I think, yes, that one we see in the city and rural areas. Most of you see a lot of informal businesses thriving on indigenous trees in particular. You see people, living in the urban fringes, bringing into the city some leafy foods, which are indigenous in knowledge. And that one in particular has been a historic and a very crucial livelihood option for women in particular, women living in rural areas. They always, if you like, take these parts of indigenous tree species, their leaves, their fruits, into the city. Some use them, let's take baobab. Baobab tree in particular is a source of nutrition, which excellent, if you like, source of nutrition, because its content of vitamin C, for instance, is very high. And we know that the World Food and Agriculture Organization has recommended that an individual should consume at least 73 kilograms of fruits and vegetables in a year. And given the fact that most of the time we see massive importation of some of these fruits and vegetables, they end up with and for, if you like, consumption of the middle class and the rich people. Most of the poor people in urban areas cannot afford to consume or buy exotic species. And paradoxically, in many instances, the local tree species are more nutritious. They provide all sorts of supplements. I just mentioned it a few while ago that the amount of the content of vitamin C, for instance, in baobab is much higher than in oranges and apples and what have you. But now you see, like, again, it's something that you can tie with climate change. For instance, in Nigeria, we don't grow much. We don't have that comparative advantage of growing apples, grapes. But we do import this thing at large scale from South Africa. So you can imagine what it takes, the haulage, to bring this freight of exotic fruits, while on the other hand, these are things that you can locally grow, a variety of them, many of them, which I think now are being, of course, being exported. To answer your question directly, some of them because of their potentials, because some of their consumers in other parts of the world, especially the rich world, do understand that these are mostly organic fruits and vegetables, so they do export them. And this now tells you that, yes, there are many opportunities for green entrepreneurship through these indigenous tree species. And then, importantly, another aspect of the business potentials of indigenous trees is it has to do with their, medicinal values. many people know that, oh, if you have this kind of element, this particular tree part, its roots, barks, leaves, has some medicinal value. So people really utilize that, and mostly when they don't have them, they buy them. And there are some, many trado medicinal stalls around the city, which are part and parcel of the urban and, of course, even rural informal economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Elio. That's a very comprehensive answer. Yeah, far beyond what I was hoping for. That's a really nice linkage. I think that brings in many areas: local-based business, nutrition. So yeah, it's so many aspects of the food system and climate change coming together with that point. Okay, it's just gone past 3:30. I would love to continue this discussion, but I'm thinking perhaps unless someone has any further point they would like to raise, I'll hand back to John, who I think would perhaps like to bring in some the panel's members to wrap up the session. So thanks to everyone, and back to you, John.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everybody who contributed there. We set out at the beginning of the afternoon to contribute to the development of NRI's and FANCY's strategy for researching climate change and for doing research with impact. We've had lots of suggestions, some of which fit together, some of which are outliers, but overall, I think they definitely achieved that goal. I'd like to add that Aliou Barao, who's just spoken so eloquently on trees and tree planting in dryland areas, is actually one of our panelists. So he's I'm glad to see that he's coming in advance to make those comments. I'd just like to give a chance to Jeremy Hagar, who was our other panelist. Unfortunately, Fiona Noonan has had to leave the meeting, but if Jeremy could make any final comments from his point of view.
Yes, thank you, John. I think probably I've said most of what I want to say, but I guess I would just like to, reiterate the importance of the multidisciplinarity and multi-objective nature of the problems we're dealing with, and the importance of developing appropriate tools for that build on our academic understanding, but also enable stakeholders in the decisions to make informed decisions in accordance with their values.
Thank you. And Aliou, apart from the specific focus on trees, were there any other reflections you wanted to make?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, John, for the invitation to partake in this very nice and enriching seminar. I think as I would just want to talk through all the 5 papers briefly from Pamela, Truly, Alex, Ann, and Uche and Brooke, who raised many interesting, relevant, focused issues of interest to the PANCY project. I must say that I appreciate and salute all of them for the interesting presentation that they delivered. Now, I want to say categorically that I do agree and accept most of the research questions and research priority areas that they identified. I think they are very, very relevant. However, I want to really identify and add more. Look at, for instance, the issue of conflicts in Uche and Brooke's paper. And I begin to think, and this is quite as well relevant to other papers, like the one by Pamela on climate change and water. I want to believe that in drylands of Nigeria, which are exposed to multiple climate stresses, in particular droughts and flooding, I want to believe that these areas are now experiencing de-agrarianization, not the one that Europe experienced to move from agriculture to industrial aviation, no. But this one, because it's a complex and uncertain phenomenon, we see more of conflicts in a degraded and vulnerable environment are pushing people, are displacing people from, their ancestral lands. And this one is leading to aggravation of food insecurity in these areas. So you can see that it's a polycentric, it's a multiple challenge. Climate change, conflicts, each one, they are all pushing each other and making the whole thing to be very complex with, if you like, a borderless impact. In the sense, because they are unbounded in the sense that, look at it, it triggers, as I said, displacement to cities, displacement to other countries possible. And yes, we have experienced cases where even in northern Nigeria, some people have to move to the neighboring Niger Republic. But Niger Republic is also not safe. It's even drier than Nigeria. But interestingly, I want to recall the work of Motimo, where I want to link up with the issue of institutions. Michael Motimo, I think in one of his works, he observed that the institutions protecting environment in the drier Niger Republic are more effective than somehow greener Nigeria, because remote sensing imageries show that there are more trees in the side of Niger Republic, which is drier than in Nigeria. If you take, for instance, some species, when I travel to parts of Niger, you find maybe 100, you can count 100 species of some trees, like albida, acacia albida, but if you move to the Nigerian side, you hardly see 5 of them. Of course, I know there is this cross-border exchange of energy between the two countries, but definitely the institutions there are stronger in Niger. Another area that really needs more attention and the priority is informality. We need really to put more attention. All the time we are thinking of how governments, multilateral agencies, development partners talk. More often than not, when these organizations, institutions, and governments work, more often than not, I agree that there is now increasing recognition of the role of informal sector in economy, environment, agriculture, water resources management, and what have you. Take example of river basin development authorities in Nigeria. They were designed, planned, and constructed in a way that they exclude some resource users. For instance, the pastoralists who used to, move around within their informally designated stock routes. When Nigeria was developing its river basin areas in the name of irrigation, they were secluded, they were marginalized. And that marginalization today is breeding the problem that we have in Nigeria of farmer-pastoralist conflicts, right? So, and besides that, as I said, this marginalization of users like the pastoralist has its own costs and consequences for the ecology, for the ecosystem. Now, most of the river basin areas where irrigation is taking place in Nigeria, they are not able to produce at 10% of their capacity. And the water bodies which are being impounded, which again leads to desiccation of Lake Chad, for instance, are not productive. And at the same time, today they are being overtaken by taifa grass. If to say, I think in one of the works by Nagendra, I mean, of Hari, the name just, but I'm sure many of you will know the person, that Indian Nagendra, a leading environmental scientist. She cited an example where in India, in one of their forest protected ecosystems, they banned or prevented pastoralists from moving in. But that very act of stopping them actually had consequences, of which the forest, the protected ecosystem start to die. So exactly we see that also practically happening in Nigeria. If to say the pastoralists had access to those sites, then the taifa grass, they will tilt the balance against, these invasive species. So these are the issue. And as again, another critical issue that needs research that needs to be prioritized is the issue of communication. We do a lot of studies. Let me, this is fundamental. Give me maybe a minute round up on this. Let me give you an example of Linda Stringer's work, recent presentation she did at York University, where she gave, in the York talk, where she, she engaged the communities in their own language. She brought back the research that she did over a decade. She took it back, translated it into the people, partied with people, and people were happy. They celebrated the research. It was only after 10 years also that the community where she worked come to understand what she meant by land management. So this is common with most of us doing research in food security, land management. The people don't know, so we have to find alternatives and new strategies to communicate with people, tell them the results and let them know clearly and unmistakably what our research stands for and where they can complement research, science, and policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words, Aliou, and I think that they're a very fitting end to the session. I'd just like to say that we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered some questions that are more methodological or even philosophical, the importance of reframing previously defined problems and breaking out of solutions that are defined by our disciplines. We've talked about the tensions between participation and producing workable solutions and how those could be resolved over different timescales or by different approaches. And that, of course, leads us on to thinking about how participation and learning themselves should be objects for our research. We've also covered some empirical topics. I mean, this is quite apart from the wonderful presentations earlier in the afternoon, but during the discussion, we've moved on to this issue of trees. And one other topic that was raised in the chat, I noticed, was that of youth, raised by Abu Bakr Ibrahim. And thanks for that reminder of the importance of youth and the current lack of positive experiences in engaging rural youth in these issues. On this issue of trees, I actually think it's great because it is very empirical. It is about living trees of different species and their utility to people who live in this case, dry land areas. But it's also a case with multiple stakeholder perspectives, with the different ambiguous roles of business and of governments, which can bring in some of the more methodological and researchy aspects of what we've covered. So I think within NRI, we may well be thinking a bit more about dryland trees and bringing some of NRI's expertise on forests together with the expertise of our partners who are predominantly in the dryland regions of Africa, in northern Nigeria, as we've heard today, in Uganda, and I think sadly none of them could join us, but our colleagues at Haramaya University in Ethiopia. So trees may well be very much on our agenda. I'd just like to say that we will work out how to make the recording of this session, and if all the presenters are agreeable, how to make the presentations available as widely as possible to you who've participated. Adrienne, you mentioned in the link in the chat the feedback session tomorrow. Is that open to all?
Yes, that's right. It's useful if people actually would have liked to have attended 2 sessions running parallel. So you'll have a chance to hear very brief, but nevertheless some feedback on the main challenges and priorities identified both in this group, but also the other program sessions. And also that I've included the link to posters. There's, I think, half a dozen or so posters on different topics there, if you'd like to look at those. And just to quickly say that we're thinking of making the recordings. We will be putting a story on our website, and there will be links to the session recordings and to presentations from that website.
Excellent. Thank you much. Thank you very much for all those points. And yes, the link to tomorrow's feedback session is in the chat, as is the links to the posters. And with that, I will just once again thank our presenters, our discussants, and our panelists who spoke really in the body of the discussion rather than as panelists, and all of you for a very, very interesting afternoon, and hope to see some of you at the feedback session tomorrow. And we here in NRI are always available to discuss these issues, and no issue is more important than climate change and what we as researchers can do about it. Thank you all very much.